This is the Romans Education Part 3, and this is Session 2B. This is Session 2B because we did not get finished with Session 2 last week, so we are going to do that. But in keeping with what we've been doing lately, I'm going to go ahead and do another prologue at the start of this. It gives me another opportunity to do this. As you know, we've been looking at the issue of how to reconcile God's goodness and the presence of evil and suffering in the world. And to say that more concisely, this is known as theodicy. Theodicy is a Greek word that's made, it's actually a word made up of two Greek words that means God's justness. In other words, it is a defense of God and His goodness and His power in the face of evil and suffering in the world. Okay, and so because we're discussing this, and these are important questions to consider, I want to continue these prologues here. So let's do this. So the question you may be saying to yourself, and if you're watching on Zoom, you're saying, "Hey, I thought we needed the education." But I think you really do need this too. The question is this a big deal? Do we really need to be spending the time on this? And it is a big deal, and I'm going to illustrate that to you in just one of those ways today. Because over this issue, there are people who have shipwrecked their faith and have decided that they are atheist or agnostic. And because they cannot reconcile the pervasiveness of evil and suffering in the world with the goodness of an all-powerful God. Now, that may appear like it has nothing to do with us, but I made a surprising discovery as I was putting this prologue together. As a matter of fact, originally, today we're going to be talking about where the origin of evil and where evil comes from, because we actually defined evil in the last two, and so, but I put that off for 1 week because I discovered that our old understanding of prayer is complicit in overthrowing the faith of those who actually wonder why prayer doesn't work the way we have been led to believe. Now, that's a long mouthful, so I hope that you're following that. Almost no one, when they're debating theodicy, talks about the role of prayer. And the reason is because they're going all the way back to where evil started and where it got its origin. And so because that doesn't readily occur, just how much damage is being done by the traditional outlook on prayer. And I mean to demonstrate that to you today. Prayer is that seemingly unimportant ingredient that serves as a catalyst to shipwreck the faith of people who are honestly asking questions. Let me just give you you've heard me tell this before. Everybody on Zoom probably that have been listening for any time but all knows this. Certainly the folks here have heard it. There were a couple of different instances in my own ministry when I was praying for God to do something. It was something I was convinced was His will. It would glorify Him. It was for the good of the saints. And I was praying for that to happen in a particular way and to not be obstructed. And it did get obstructed, and so I went to all of my colleagues there in Baton Rouge to talk to them about why didn't this work. I fasted and prayed. I had faith. I believed God. I'd confessed all my sins. I'd jumped through all the loopholes that that I could think of. Every one of them, at the end of walking through those same sets of caveats, just said, God does some things sometimes we don't understand why. Here's what bothered me about that. That never shows up in the sermons that we were preaching. When we preached those sermons, we talked about claiming these verses and believing God, and He is going to do it, and He is faithful, and all of that. But we don't ever stand up and say, and back then in that old understanding of prayer, we never stood up to say, look, it just may not happen. We just didn't do it that way. Although lots of times folks were praying for things that did not get answered. Well, what I want to do today is I want to give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain about how critical this issue is. So let me set it up. Even people who think God is responsible because he allowed evil into the world, some think that he even created evil. Even if you think that, you can be okay with that as long as you have this idea that if something bad is happening to me, I can pray and ask God and he will intervene and change my circumstances. So as long as he will fix it, we're okay. But if you start praying like I did, and then it doesn't get fixed, I went on this quest to find out, why didn't this work? And here's what happens. You either conclude that God doesn't have the power to fix it. If you think he has the power, then maybe he's not as good as we thought he was because he didn't fix it. Or they could come to the conclusion that there just is no God. But there's a fourth way to look at it, and this is the way I looked at it. I didn't think the problem was with God, and I didn't think the problem was with the Bible. You know what I thought the problem was? With my understanding of the doctrine. There must be something I'm not seeing, or something I think that's wrong, that is leading me down this path because this isn't working. Well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually show you 3 short clips from a debate. It's on YouTube. It's called Theodicy, God, and Suffering, if you want to go watch it later on your own. And this is a debate between 2 men. Let me just introduce them to you. One of them, many of you are probably familiar with. His name is Dinesh D'Souza. He is a conservative Christian. He is the president of King's College in New York. You've probably seen him in a lot of different venues. And he is taking the defense, the theodicy approach, that God is good and God is all-powerful and why there is suffering in the world. The guy on the other end is a guy named Bart Ehrman, E-H-R-M-A-N. And Bart is a accomplished and well-recognized authority in Old Testament studies. He's actually a professor of studies at the University of North Carolina. By his own admission in this video, Bart Ehrman no longer believes in the God of the Bible. He calls himself an agnostic because he said there may be some other God out there. I don't know if there is or not. But if you're talking about the God of the Bible, I no longer believe in the God of the Bible. And in the opening part of this debate, which I will not show you because we only have so much time here, Bart Ehrman is going to stand up and say, I'm going to tell you how I came to the place that I am. He talks about having a born-again, I'm using his terminology, he had a born-again experience as a teenager at 15 or 16 years old, I can't remember which. When he graduated from high school, he went off to Moody Bible Institute, where he received a diploma in theology and biblical studies. And then he went off to I can't remember what. Anyway, he has a whole list of the schools that he went to. He began to pastor the Princeton Baptist Church, and he was teaching in Rutgers University theology students. For his doctorate, he was doing the work on suffering and evil in the world in light of the biblical theology. That's not exactly the title, but that's pretty much what it was. And he is going to say, I started off my ministry as a committed Christian. He said, I now no longer believe in the God of the Bible because of this issue. And so I want to play I want to play the first part of this. Now, this is about 3 minutes long, so just watch this with me. For us here in the auditorium, it's going to come up on this screen right over here. So, Mark, go ahead and hit that.
That the free will explanation doesn't resolve what I would call the theological problem of suffering. The theological problem of suffering is very simple. If God is all-powerful, He can do anything that He wants. If He's all-loving, He doesn't want people to suffer any more than you want people to suffering, and you're a loving person. God can do anything He wants. He doesn't want people to suffer, and yet people suffer. How does one explain that? Well, that's the problem of theodicy. Most Christians think that God intervenes in history, intervenes in our lives in order to deal with suffering. God intervenes in our lives in order to deal with suffering, so that when something goes wrong, we can pray about it and God will help resolve the problem. If that's the case, why doesn't God intervene more often? We all have experienced suffering in our lives, and we know of others who have. After I finished this class at Rutgers, I experienced a lot of suffering myself, as did other people. Cancer, taking away loved ones in the prime of life, teenage suicide, birth defects, failed marriages, a friend who escaped the killing fields of Cambodia, homelessness, poverty, starvation. We all know people who have had these problems. I kept reading about issues pertaining to suffering. The Holocaust, 6 million Jews murdered in cold blood. Genocides in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur. A flu epidemic in 1918 that killed 30 million people worldwide. The flu. World poverty and starvation. I came to a point where none of the biblical answers or traditional answers were satisfying to me. Most of the Bible has one thing in common. It believes in a God who intervenes in our world. That is the basis for the traditions in the Old Testament of God saving the children of Israel and making them His people. It's the basis for the belief in Jesus' cross and resurrection, that God intervened in our world for good. God's intervention is what's behind our idea that prayer works. But if God intervenes, why doesn't He? In our world, every 5 seconds, a child dies of starvation. Every 5 seconds. In our world, every minute, 25 people die from diseases from unclean water. Every hour, 300 people die of malaria. If God intervenes, why doesn't He intervene? The Holocaust, genocides, terrorist attacks, starvation, poverty, tsunamis, hurricanes, earthquakes. Eventually, the answers did not satisfy me, and I came to be unable to affirm the very basis of my Christian faith. I became an agnostic. I no longer believe in the God of the Bible. I do not believe in a good and all-powerful God who intervenes in this world. Let me stress that it's not my goal.
Okay. That's all I needed you to hear from that clip. And he has put his finger precisely on it. Now, as you hearing that, you may think, oh, you know what? I see part of the error of his thinking. Because he sees God intervening in the Old Testament. He thinks God is continuing to intervene in the New Testament, but he has other problems as well. And because he doesn't rightly divide the word, he cannot discern that God is now dealing with people in a different way than He did in the Old Testament. And by the way, he's going to condemn God's dealings in the Old Testament too. But I wanted you to see, this is the part of the opening remarks of this debate. Now, D'Souza is going to stand up and give his opening remarks. We're not going to look at any of that. I want to go now. Mark is going to skip us to the summation. And so in a minute and a half, he is going to summarize, at least we're just going to look at a minute and a half of his summary of where he's coming from. So go ahead, Mark.
There are people starving to death in this world. Yes, if God's in charge of this world, he must be different from what we thought. But where does that leave us? What is he really like? God does intervene in the world according to traditional Jewish and Christian thinking. And my guess is that Dinesh thinks that God intervenes in the world and that he answers prayer. If that's the case, why is it there's so much suffering? Now, Dinesh differentiates between moral evil and natural evil, and he points out that God did not cause the Holocaust. Fair enough. Of course God didn't cause the Holocaust, and nobody said that God caused the Holocaust. But does God answer prayer or not? When 6 million of his people are crying out to help, does he answer or not? If you think the answer is no, he does not answer prayer, what does that do to your faith? And what does it do to Dinesh's faith? Does God intervene in this world or not? Or maybe he didn't like those Jews. Maybe he would have saved the Christians. Really? Maybe God likes us better than the people who are starving to death because we had a very nice dinner, thank you very much. So maybe God's on our side, but he's not on the side of the people who are suffering. Is that what we want to think? Is that going to be our theology? I simply don't buy the idea that the laws of nature are the way they have to be or we could not have life. I think that this is not a solid argument in the least.
Okay. So he is assuming, of course, what almost every Christian assumes is that by prayer God is intervening in the affairs of this world. And you know what he's saying, in essence? If God is doing that, he's doing an awfully poor job of it. What he doesn't talk about, and I'm really surprised about it, is how Christians would talk about, God answering prayer to find their car keys, but not answering prayer for 6 million Jews who are being tortured and murdered. So that makes God look awfully capricious. So you understand this problem, this is the whole thing that we're discussing. And so while we're studying godly justice, I wanted to talk to you about the supreme question of the justness of God himself, because I obviously don't agree with Bart. But he is trying to come to an answer about why things are. And the theology that's normally held in church today is punishing guys who are looking around and saying, wait a minute, why is it working like this? And we look at them like, now he's the bad guy because he's an agnostic. He didn't start off that way. Now what I want to do is I want to take you to the last one. This is about 45 seconds. This is a part of the debate when each man begins to ask questions of the other guy. And they swap back and forth in these questions for a while. By the way, if you understand that Dinesh is defending what I believe is an erroneous theology, you'll understand why he doesn't do a very good job of defending against these arguments. Yeah. He makes a good argument. Here's the other thing. In this answer, and question and answer, he is going to ask Dinesh if he believes God answers prayer and intervenes in our lives. Dinesh is going to make a very courageous answer. But it's not the one that any Christian wants to hear. It's going to be a truthful answer as far as he knows. Because he thinks there are some times when God has intervened in the world. But he's going to tell you this. Those times are very, very rare. No preacher will preach that sermon. Do you know why? Because we're going to have prayer meetings every week and we're going to ask God to do a whole bunch of stuff. And here's the thing that's bothersome to me. When whole churches pray for all of these things and they don't work out, we never ask ourselves why. But the guys who do ask themselves why, like Bert Ehrman, looks at us and says, you guys are blind, superstitious followings of a religion that doesn't work. Because the fact that your theology doesn't actually work doesn't bother you. You know what? In that sense, he is absolutely right. No different from a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or any of the others. So let me let you watch Dinesh's answer. I applaud him. Look, he believes that God does, but he's going to tell the truth about it, and it's not very flattering, and I don't think Dinesh wins this debate. And that's problematic. But because neither men know how to rightly divide the word, neither men know the difference in prayer in the dispensation of grace and how it happened back in Israel's program, they don't have the foundation to be able to address these issues on Bart's part or answer these questions on Dinesh's part. So here's Dinesh's it's only 45-second answer. It's all it is. So go ahead and hit it, please, Mark.
All right, so Dinesh, I want to know whether you believe that God answers prayer, and if you do think so, do you think that God sometimes does intervene in our world? And the more involved part of that is, if you think that God does not answer prayer, then I'd like to know, and that he doesn't intervene, I'd like to know in what sense you consider yourself a Christian. If you do think that God answers prayer and does intervene, then I'd like to know whether it bothers you that God doesn't answer prayer for people who are starving to death and being tortured and who are being murdered and so forth.
I think that God can and does answer prayer. I think that God can and does intervene in the world. He has, and I believe he still does. However, I see this intervention in the world as rare, as an expression of God's gratuitous love, and something that does not occur on a regular basis. In fact, if it did, there would be we could no longer speak of the lawfulness of nature. So a miracle, by definition, is a rare contravention of a natural law. But I do believe it does happen and has happened.
That's it. That's his whole answer. So if you're sitting there rooting for this, how does that make you feel? Now, I'm going to answer Bart's question before we get into our book. Because Bart's question is, because he thinks he's got both bases covered. If you do think God answers prayer and is intervening, how come he's doing such a terrible job at it? All Dinesh really said was, yeah, it's rare. Is that what you would say on Wednesday night prayer meeting? Hey, we got this whole prayer list here, and go and let you know most of these are not going to get done. My question would be, if you thought God did, by the way, some of those are going to get answered whether you pray about them or not, right? So, here's Sarita home because of some physical things. We all want her to get better. In the old days, we'd have been praying for God to make her better. You know what? She is going to get better, and she'll be back. If Mark could quit pushing her down the stairs. And she'll get better, and she'll be back. But, and in the same amount of time as if we were in the old days, praying for her to get better and come back. There is no medical data that shows that people who are being prayed for, recover from a broken arm faster. I mean, there is no such thing. So I mean, some people do just heal a little faster than others, but basically, you know what the doctor tells everybody? 6 weeks. It's not such a well-known phenomena. He says 6 weeks unless your church is praying for you, in which case tomorrow you should be okay. There is no tomorrow. And we talk about that. So, I want to answer, though, his other base, because that's, if you think God is, why is there all this stuff going on? And why are we talking about God answering such trivial things when terrible things are happening in the world? Children are being kidnapped and molested and tortured and killed. You're talking about innocent kids here as far as their own culpability, but yet God is only interested in helping some kid get his beach ball back that the wind blew out on the water. So it makes you wonder about that, right? That then he says, and if you don't think God is intervening in the world, on what basis do you call yourself a Christian? So I want to answer that question. On the basis of 13 epistles in the New Testament. On the basis of the Apostle Paul and him explaining that the work God is doing today is in the inner man, not in the outer world. And if you can't understand that concept, you may well come to the same conclusion that Bart Ehrman has come to. And I feel sorry for him, because no one taught him enough about the Bible to be able to. And you know what? You can become professor emeritus of Old Testament studies and still lose your faith in God because you don't understand the fundamentals of the Bible. That's why this old issue of prayer is a big deal. And I know people wonder about it all the times, Mike, you talk about that. And you know, in the old days, I used to do this. Look, if you want to do that, you want to pray. I'm not their tutor and governor. That's still true. And I would say, and you can do that, and God's not mad at you. That's still true. He's not. But what I am going to add to that is, don't think that by fostering that erroneous doctrine today, that there are no consequences for that. Because there are. And I would love to ask that audience questions at the end. I would love to have been able to ask Bart, if you are wrong and you are impacting people in a way that is going to wind up sending them to hell. I mean, he had what he called a born-again experience when he was 15 years old. If he did, he's going to make it. If he trusted Christ as his Savior, he's going to make it. I would want to ask, how will you think about that when you make it and you find out the God of the Bible does exist, and now you have spent a lifetime trying to convince people not to believe in him? If you're wrong, I'm just thinking, if you're wrong, there is a lot of consequence to that, and you should probably tone this down. Because you're admittedly an agnostic, which means you don't know. You said, but Mike, what if you're wrong? What? Asking people to be kind and tenderhearted and loving, and there is no heaven or hell. If I'm wrong, you were just an animal on your way to death anyway. The only thing I tried to do was have you have a little more noble attitude about it in the process. No one's going to hell if I'm wrong. They are if he's wrong. And I think if you realize that, it would make you change the tenor of what it is that you're doing. That's the question I would like to say to him, not in an attempt to embarrass him at all. I mean that. But to get him to think about the consequences of what's there. Because I believe, whether he would accept it or not is one thing, but I actually believe I could sit down with Bart Ehrman for 2 hours and at least explain to him why those are not an issue to my faith. He might would. He seems like he's just a guy like I was, looking for answers. And there are answers, but you have to know some things about the Bible to get it. And just being an authority on Old Testament studies is not going to be enough to do it. You have to understand Paul's unique ministry and the dispensation of grace in which you live. So, anyway, I just wanted to take a little time here to do that today in this prologue.
Mike?
Yes, sir.
I've thought a lot about this issue through the years. And but the way I look at it now, I'm not saying God doesn't hear all those prayers people pray, but God is also long-suffering, and I believe it hurts him, but he has a program that he's not going to break with us. And that long-suffering, in the end, they'll get their comeuppance.
Right.
The
Right.
way I feel about it.
He's a God of justice, and nothing is going to go unpunished.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. So, yeah, and you're right. He has a program he is not going to violate. Because if he violates it once, you know what God has just done? He's just opposed himself, which basically disqualifies him from being God. Can you be perfect and oppose the program that you have put into place? So the very nature of God is at stake in this. That's why I say there's no exceptions to this rule. When people say, well, God has the power to, yeah, he has the power to do a lot of things, but he can't violate what he has established. He cannot counter his own divine institutions. He cannot. He cannot lie. You know, he cannot be tempted with evil. He can't. There's things he can't do, or he just wouldn't be God. You're absolutely right. Okay, so let's get back to our book now, and we'll finish up lesson 2. And so we talked about, last time we were over in Matthew chapter 5, and we were looking at that verse over there in Matthew 5, that if a man smite thee on the one cheek, turn to him the other also. Remember, this is being written to the believing remnant of Israel, and the Lord is talking to them about 3 particular things here. We've only covered the first one. The first one is offenses committed against the remnant. If a man smite thee on the right cheek. I told you last time that what this is an issue of is governmental law. I'm going to establish that in the rest of the lesson today. All of this in Matthew 5 is about governmental law. The second part of this, we'll read that in just a second, and this is offenses by the remnant. And the third one is obedience to the law of the land. There's the 3 things that are being talked about here in Matthew 5. The reason we came over here, just to refresh your memory, is because we got into Romans 12:17, where it says, recompense to no man evil for evil. And you see that evil for evil, and their mind runs over to Matthew chapter 5, and it says, Jesus said, you have heard it said by them of old time, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, and now he's going to talk about these 3 issues, and people think he's saying there's something wrong with the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But you understand, that was part of the governmental law of Israel, part of the law of the land. In Romans 12:17, we're talking about individual justice. If someone does something to you, like if they don't notice you on the highway and they start over and you have to swerve to keep from getting hit, that doesn't give you the right to ram them, a mile down the interstate because, they weren't paying attention. So we're really talking about 2 different things here, but let me just work through this so that we can all see it. First of all, this offenses against the remnant, let me put this in a nutshell for you about how this works. The Bible is not saying here in Matthew 5 to the members of the believing remnant that you cannot defend yourself against an attack. It is not saying if someone attacks you, just let them attack you and don't do anything about it. That's not what this is saying. I know you're looking at that because of the way that you already are predisposed to look at the verse. But the law actually tells you about this, and this is the point that Jesus is making here. Let's suppose that Clifford is out at the airport, and he's over there at his hangar, and a guy approaches him and says, "Hey, can you loan me can you give me $20? I need to get me some food or something." And let's suppose Clifford says, "You know what? I don't have any cash money on me. but if you want to hang around, you know what? I'll take you somewhere, and I can use one of my cards, and I can get you something to eat. And it makes the guy angry, and you know what he decides to do is he wants to attack Clifford and maybe try to take his wallet. But what he doesn't know is that Clifford knows judo, and he is not going to get Clifford's wallet. And so if the guy comes at him, and Clifford can defend himself, when the guy realizes, I can't do this, I'm just making up a story. I probably just should have said it in line with the law. As soon as that guy stops, Clifford cannot recompense evil for evil. Legally, you cannot be an aggressor. Now I'm going to give it to you because Texas is a carry state. So here's a guy, and he points a gun at you. If you're able to disarm him and take his gun, you do not have the legal right to shoot him. You know why? You're shooting an unarmed man. And now the law will be against you. You can defend yourself, but you cannot. Once that assault is finished, you can't respond in kind. So if someone smites you on the cheek, and that's it, guess what? It's over. If you didn't block it, and you got hit on the cheek, and that's what it was, it's over. AKA Will Smith at the Oscars. So, for Chris Rock, that was over. So I'm just saying, this is what this is about. That you don't, if a guy tries to beat you up and he can't do it, and you trip him and put him on his back, and now the assault is over, you don't get to kick him while he's down there. That is now assault on your part. That's what the turn the other cheek part is about. So I just want everybody to be clear. The law today actually lines up exactly with what Jesus is telling them to do and how to act in response to that. Okay, so now after that, we're going to go to verse 40. So let me just bring that up on the PowerPoint. And if any man, this is the second issue, and if any man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. Well, look, let me just tell you, if a guy is suing you, then evidently what? You've done something that he's seeking recourse for. Now, we're not told what the particular crime is here, but it says to sue thee at the law and take away thy coat. So evidently the law has concluded that, and Jesus is saying this to the remnant still, so he says if you commit an offense and now you're required to pay a certain thing for that, he's going to say, let him have thy cloak also. What's going on here? It's that he is saying, go above what the law requires to make restitution for offenses that you, as members of the little flock, have committed. So, with me on that? So that is the way that God, the Lord is instructing the members of the little flock to act. The question is, why? Why not this? Why not that? Why just do what the law required? If they take away your coat, give him your cloak also. Go beyond what the law required to make restitution. And you have to ask yourself why. What is happening that needed to have taken place? The point here is about I have a couple of verses. Let's just look at them. No, I guess I got it out of whack. So I guess I won't show you that. In your notes, there's a couple of verses there that you'll be able to look at. And okay, so let's just do this third one. Matthew 5:41. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. And this is talking about our obedience to the law of the land. So here's the context about if someone compels thee to go a mile, go with him twain. if a royal command went out from the king, say, and there is something that he wanted delivered, there was some item that the king wanted delivered somewhere along with maybe some kind of a message, whoever it was that was transporting that across the country had the ability, where whoever they ran into, to compel that person to carry that luggage for a mile. The law said you had to carry it for a mile. Then they were released of that obligation, and the courier would either carry it himself or find someone else to compel to carry it for a mile. And here's what Jesus says. In trying to obey the law, because we've already set this precedent. You're not going to you know what? You're not going to try to get even by doing to someone what they've done to you. You're not if you're in the wrong, you're going to go above what the law requires to make restitution. And then in obedience to the law, he says, if a guy compels you to go a mile, do what? Go twice as far. Do more than you have to do. Exceed the law and its requirement. And what is he doing here? He is talking about the law is the very minimum for righteousness. And he wants the members of the little flock to go beyond that in their duty toward the law. And because he wants the little flock at the end of the day to fulfill the righteousness of the law without the law. That's why we're not under the law. So that it can be the very righteousness of God in us. And when Jesus is talking to the little flock, he is already laying the groundwork for them to understand that principle. And so he does that with regard to obeying the law of the land and making restitution for offenses, and of course not taking up that offense when something is done to them. This is not a new concept. Look with me in Jeremiah 6:31. And I will punish him and his seed and his servants for their iniquity, and I will bring upon them and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem and upon the men of Judah all the evil that I have pronounced against them, but they hearkened not. Wait a minute. What is that evil that God says he's going to bring upon the house of Judah? Judgment, punishment. Right. Why is that sufficient? Bart would need to hear this. Why would that be sufficient? Because he's going to talk about God in the Old Testament doing evil to his people. But you understand that his people entered into a performance contract under the law in which they got the blessings by doing this and they got the punishments by doing that. And God gave them 3 opportunities to let him deal with them by his grace. They rejected all 3 of them. So God is not the monster here. What he is doing is teaching Israel that they cannot produce this on their own. They cannot justify themselves. They cannot sanctify themselves. They need God to do what he wanted to do in the beginning, and that is to give that to them as a free gift of his grace, to provide it for them and then give it to them as a gift. That's the only way they'll ever get it. And that's the school. That's what the law was teaching them, huh? You know, it was the hubris of we're his chosen people, and we've got this, and thinking of themselves, let me use Paul, more highly than they ought to think. It was a national pride. That's why over in Romans 1, when Paul is talking about the guiltiness of the world, one of those excuses that he has to deal with is what they're thinking, hey, we're the sons of Abraham, we're intrinsically righteous just because of who we are. And God is going to come along later in Romans and say, they are not all of Israel who are of Israel. Had he say that? Now that I said it, I think I got it backwards. But what he's saying is, just because you're a son of Abraham doesn't mean you're part of the true Israel. This is something that comes by faith and obtains the righteousness which is by faith. Okay. So the evil is God's punishment. One more, Jeremiah 44:29. And this shall be a sign unto you, saith the Lord, that I will punish you in this place, that you may know my words shall surely stand against you. And I didn't highlight it in yellow, but stand against you for evil. Once again, he's talking about the punishment because of their actions. And that's why In verse 39 of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says not to resist the evil. Resist not evil. You know what he's saying? Don't resist the punishment that is rightly coming to you. You know what it means to resist. Well, the evil here is not moral evil. This whole context has been in the matter of the law. So the evil would be the punishment for violating the law. So he says, don't resist that. As a matter of fact, go beyond that if you're making restitution. If you're compelled to go a mile, go 2 miles. That's the point that he's trying to make. Don't resist this. Go above it. And he's trying to teach them about that. So Matthew chapter 5, verse 39, but I say unto you that you resist not evil. Don't try to escape the penalties for your actions. Do more than the law required you to do. And in that context of Matthew 5, the little flock, they're victims here, but they're perpetrators here. They're just citizens here. But it doesn't matter in which role they are. He has instruction for them about how they're supposed to conduct themselves. And so now we're going to take this back to Romans 12:17, where Paul says, recompense to no man evil for evil. So I want to give you an example of this in my own life, and I need to do it quickly. You know, here I am down here in Texas, minding my own business, teaching the Bible to the best of my ability. And I believe that the Bible is the infallible Word of God. I believe it's the final authority in all matters of faith and practice. And you know what? My biggest critics in the whole world are my brothers in Christ. Now, that's okay. I'm not whining about that. In fact, I can endure all those things for which I'm criticized. But the truth is, and I'm saying this honestly, I love those guys. I do. And I appreciate their ministries. I realize that they are doing good in many, many ways for the cause of Christ. And I do hope for their continued success. I do. I don't agree with everything they teach, just like they don't agree with everything I teach. But in my mind, that doesn't make them bad guys. They rightly divide the word like me. They see two programs, Israel and the mystery, just like I do. Most of them are King James guys. They love the Lord, you know, all of those things. But if I disagree with them over something, I don't make a big deal out of that. And listen carefully. It's not because I don't think truth is important. Truth is important. But I can't, in defending the truth, I cannot afford to make it personal. I can't. You know why? Because if I start making that personal, I will quit loving them and thinking about them the way I'm supposed to. And I don't want to do that. Now, maybe that isn't a problem for them, but it is for me. And so I have to focus on teaching the things that I understand and not acting like God appointed me to be the sheriff over my preacher brethren, because he did not. So I need to do this. I need to live out of the doctrine and in honor prefer these men who are my critics. I need to bless and curse not. That comes right out of Romans 12. I need to treat them with godly, loving kindness as though they were part of my own family. Because guess what? They are. They are part of my own family. And so I'm not saying I've never gotten that wrong. I have. But I work on it constantly. And look, if those guys ever needed my help, I hope they would know they could call on me and I would help them, because this is not about how they treat me. It's about Christ in me, treating them the way that God has called me to do that. It's not about recompensing evil for evil. When they have a conference and they want to call me by name and discredit me and talk about what a bad guy I am, I will never have a conference where I will do the same for them. Not going to happen. I'll just stand before the Lord in that understanding of the Scripture, and then that's all I need to worry about is myself. So I just want to use that as an example to say that notice that in verse 17, Paul has to tell us don't recompense evil for evil. Do you know why? Because it's our natural default. Let me show it to you. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Because that's the way we think. It's the way our culture is designed. It's the way our society functions. And if you don't, you're looked at like you're the strange one. But that's okay, because you're actually meant to put something on display here. You're supposed to separate yourself out from the way the world is. You're supposed to act differently, and you're supposed to make that manifest. Because God is doing something here through that difference. And this is why the believing remnant was told to do what they do, and it's why in Romans 12 we're being told to do what we do. And it's the very opposite of what we naturally think or do. Almost every drama program you see on TV is about somebody getting even or getting revenge. And they spend the first half of the program justifying his efforts to kill his enemies. And then the second half is him wiping them all out. And that is a very subtle way in which the culture influences how we think about our life. And I'm telling you, that's not how our Heavenly Father looks at it. And so you say, well, what is the big purpose you keep talking about? What was God trying to do with them? What's He doing with us to make us respond so differently? He is clearing the way that He might do the work of the ministry. And what is the work of the ministry? Well, 1 Timothy says, for this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who will have, number one, all men to be saved, and number two, all men to come to the knowledge of the truth. Go to your note taker, and let me help you fill this in. We're going to define what it is to come to the knowledge of the truth. And the knowledge of the truth is all the doctrinal instruction in Paul's epistles, or to say it in a nutshell, edification. So the first thing God wants is for everyone to be saved. And for those who are saved, He wants them to understand the doctrinal instruction in Paul's epistles so that they might be edified unto godliness. Now that contains a lot of subjects and a lot of different forms of doctrine. God understands that during this dispensation of grace, there is a way that optimizes the accomplishment of this goal, saving the lost and edifying the saints. And it rests partially on our treatment of those who commit evil against us. You remember when we're going to talk about, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. That's because God is setting now an atmosphere in which this ministry can actually work. If you're at war with somebody, they're not listening to you about how to be saved. That's just common sense. And so your Father wants us to think and behave in a way that we can live peaceably with all men. And the best way to do that is not to recompense evil for evil. In other words, the ministry of what? Look, we're here. We're His ambassadors. We're His sons and daughters. God's saying, while you're here, carry on this ministry for me. And by the way, that means it's not about you. It's not about you getting even or saving face or any of those kinds of things. It's about what I'm doing in the world. And that has to become more important. So back to verse 17, and here's the last part of that. And that is, provide things honest in the sight of all men. Now you've got your notes that you'll be able to read about this, but I do want to put this in a nutshell. And when he says, provide things honest in the sight of all men, here's what he's saying. Put this godly behavior on display for everybody to see. That's essentially what that is saying. And it deserves more comment, so I really need you to read the notes so that you can get that entrenched in your thinking. But why is God saying, put that on display, make it manifest for everybody to look at? Because first of all, you want the guy that has now done some offense against you, some injustice against you, you want him to be impacted by the fact that you're not going to retaliate. And may I tell you how most people are? when somebody does something and they do it just because they don't like you, or they're just being mean, or they're just having a bad day, or they're just whatever, and they do that, when you respond with godly, loving kindness, how many times have I seen that change the whole attitude of the other people? Guess what? Now you have an open door. But here's the other group that's being affected by that. Everybody that knows about this situation. Everybody that knows about it is now able to look at everybody involved, and they'll realize this guy's just being a jerk. But this guy, he has something I don't have. Now I'm going to close with this. Having what the world recognizes some things, and when you have something working in your life they wish they had, they know would be beneficial. And I am talking about a peace in your life that doesn't force you to act like the world. If you're, look, I want to say it this way, and going back to the image of God thing. When you find your identity in your Heavenly Father, you don't have to try to find it in all the things of this world and then do whatever it takes to try to get that. You can just go to work and do the best work that you can do. But you're not finding your identity in that. You found your identity in Him. It's not about, if I'm going to get even, it's about what my Father is trying to do here. And when that pervades in that, you look at that and you say to yourself, if you're in the world, I want that kind of stuff working in me. That's when you finally get to the place where now people ask about that. I'm pulling this illustration out of my own life. Saved when I was 8 years old. We had been in a church, and we go to church all the time. And then there came a day where I ran into a guy off at college who was a part of another church in Shreveport, and I really developed a good friendship with him. And so I asked my dad, I said, you think we could go over and visit this other church? And he said, sure. So we go over and visit. And you know what is in the youth group at this church? And I say the youth group, we're going to talk about the college-age kids. Is a bunch of kids who are just literally on fire for God. I had never seen that in any church we had ever been in. Kids who, on their own, just had God at the top of their list in their life and were trying to the best of their ability to live for Him in every area. And it motivated them in many, many ways. And when I saw that, you know what it did? It created a hunger in me to want to have what they had. Because I had seen all the other stuff and I didn't find anything that was appealing. But when I saw how God was making a difference in them, I thought, I want that. I'm just telling you from my own personal experience. We can be that people. That the world, who really worries and is anxious and depressed and angry and all of those things, when they can see a people who are settled in and of themselves and godliness is what is being put on display. Israel was supposed to put that on display to the world. They didn't do it. Now we are supposed to put that on display. And that's why he's talking about providing things honest in the sight of all men. These things right here, they sound simple to us, but God knows they make a huge impact on the people who are looking at it. And people are looking. I always think people are kind of like kids. You think they're not paying attention, but they are. They're hearing it. And so I want us to make that kind of impact. All right, we'll stop here.